All right, we're live. Welcome, everybody. I hope you had fun today in the conference, that you learned a lot of things. Thanks for joining me in my session, and let's get right into it and see what lies beyond logs and the power of observability with OpenTelemetry for your .NET apps. Okay, so a little bit about me first. I worked with .NET for since around 2012. Um, I am a software engineer here at Dynatrace. We are contributing, we are a team contributing to everything around OpenTelemetry. So we contribute to the specification, to several language SDKs, and to protocol and a lot of other things. Um, Together with a friend, we created this project called NuGet Trends. It's a website where you can see the download rates of your NuGet packages and see what's trending, what other people are using for packages. So yeah, make sure to take a look if you're interested. And I occasionally blog at this address here. Um, I've been intending for starting blogging about OpenTelemetry for .NET. So stay tuned for more of this related content here. Uh, right, so this is the agenda that I have prepared for us today here. So first we'll just talk about why we care about this topic, what's important about this. Then we go in a journey saying like to see what's the usual way that people troubleshoot their apps, and a small spoiler alert, it usually starts with logs. We'll take a look at the current tools, the limitations, and what other tools are there today that can help us, and tie everything together with this maybe this hot topic now, that is observability, and then move into OpenTelemetry in .NET. At the end, I have a small demo prepared, so let's hope that the demo gods are in our favor today and everything works. Yeah, in the end, we'll have some time for answering your questions. So yes, that is the plan. So let's get into it. So first, why should we care about this topic, right? Um, I imagine that everybody wants to have their applications working well, right? No bugs. Nobody likes to being awake during the night with a call that something is wrong in production, right? But we are humans, right? And it always will happen that something will go wrong, and the mistakes will happen. So it is important. We should care that not that it shouldn't care about bugs. Of course, we need to have quality in our things, but we need to care that when problems happen, and they will happen, that we have the necessary tools, the necessary data to be able to find what is wrong and ultimately fix it, right? So how do people usually go about this journey, right? So when there's a problem, how do usually they go about and see what's wrong and fix it, right? So in my experience with all these years that I worked in, all the companies that I worked in, and talked to different amazing colleagues that I worked with, um, I gather that my experience tells me that usually starts with something like this, right? So usually you get some sort of alert, and if you're already, let's say, a little bit of advanced in your observability journey, maybe you have already some synthetic tests, or some metrics already in place, define some alerts. But maybe you're still beginning, and then maybe it was just really a call from a client, or an email from a customer, or maybe a a crash report from some app, right? Um, Nevertheless, you get this, and then you start investigating, right? And usually the first thing that people look at are logs, right? Um, so maybe you need to just start scrolling to the logs, and you define this time frame of data where you think things start to go wrong, and then you mainly start scrolling that, right? You start looking into this, maybe you don't find anything, and then you maybe have to expand your search to say 3 hours. Um, so you have to go into this manual process, right? It's very laborious, probably very also tedious, uh, but the most, let's say, important thing, or troublesome thing that I can see here is that uh, apart from being very manual, you also have to know a little, like a lot about what are you looking for, right? So you're just scrolling a bunch of logs. Um, so if you don't know about the code, for example, or you don't know, for example, if the code execution path hits that log line, or if you see that log line, then things are really in bad areas. So if you don't know that, then you're just scrolling through logs, and maybe you don't really can put things together. Why things are wrong, or why things are not working, right? Um, So you need to have a lot of this brain power, and you need to do a lot of this, let's say, correlation in your mind, right, manually, right? So if you put somebody that is not so experienced with your application, they might not figure out this, right? Does this sound familiar to you, right? It definitely does to me, because I said I did this multiple times in several jobs that I worked throughout my career, and sometimes this works, right? If you're, let's say, I don't like saying simple because it's a very overloaded word, um, but if your system is not large, you might get away with just like having logs and then scrolling through them. Maybe you have one of your colleagues join you in this troubleshooting session, um, but so you can do it, but it's not really amazing, right? But like as your business start to grow, right, your application hopefully starts to succeed and getting more users, uh, and then things are not so simple anymore, right? So uh, even if you have, let's say, a simple application, it's really unlikely that you don't depend on any third-party services today, right? You might depend on a cloud provider. You might depend on some notification services or some storage, for example, or some authentication. Doesn't matter, right? Uh, it's very hard to do everything by yourself. So also probably we shouldn't be doing this. Um, so there's a lot of points of failures, right? So maybe even if you think your application is simple, it is that simple, right? Today it's really like not so easy to say. So but when your business starts to grow, and you need to distribute your apps, for example, globally, you need high availability. um, so for example, in distributed cloud native solutions, what do you do, right? So for example, in this image here is a dependency graph or application map from Uber. There's a link there. Once you get the slides, you can check the post on your own. But what do you do in this type of situation, right? It does not scale looking at logs for such a massive architecture, right? It doesn't really work. Um, so what do you do then, right? What is out there that can help us apart from logs, right? So that is all about telemetry data. So telemetry data is, let's say, metadata, more or less, that your applications produce about themselves that can help you in this troubleshooting journey. Logs is something that we already discussed briefly. Yeah, it's very well known to everybody. There's also metrics you might already know, and there's another thing called distributed trace that we also see, and then many more. There's profiling. It we will not get to others here, but those are, let's say, that it's also common. If you Google this, if you look for this, you will see a lot about the three pillars, right? That's because of log metrics and distributed tracing. So let's take a look about what is this, um, what are these concepts, what their pros and cons, and so we can lay out some groundwork here for what's coming up. So first, let's start with logs. So logs are like the bread and butter. It's probably what every one of us did when we started programming, right? With some Hello World app and so on. So logs are great because the low bar to get you started with them is really low. They offer great granularity in what you can log or what you can output from your applications. There's many great logging frameworks for .NET. There's structured logging. There's amazing tools for query to search about them. But logs only go so far, right? Again, there's the same problem that you need to have a lot of context in the application that you're looking. So if you don't know what the logs mean, or if you don't know what to look for, it's just gibberish, right? Probably most of the time for someone that is not in contact with this so much. And the other problem is that in distributed cloud native applications, like we saw in the image before, um, they each service or each application produce their own stream of logs. Um, so then it's really hard to correlate something that happened in one app that is because this log line that you're seeing in the other app is happening because of that, right? So it's really hard to correlate this, to do this in your mind mostly. So you need to have some serious superpower to be able to do this, right? Again, it is as things grow, this does not scale well. But logs are still a very good thing to have. It's like one of the first steps that you start, right? So the next telemetry thing that we saw is there are metrics. So metrics are also very popular. You can see them in a lot of blog posts about dashboards and alerts. So they are very popular in those areas to define also service level objectives, service level indicators. Um, so metrics are great because they really offer you an overview of the overall health of your system, right? So you look at the dashboard, for example, depending how you have it configured, you can immediately tell if things are okay or if things are not okay, right? And metrics can be anything, right? It can be metrics that you get, for example, for CPU memory, for request rate, error rate, and things like that, but can also be metrics about your business, right? So your custom metrics, for example, you want to measure the number of sales or the number of customers in your store, or let's say how many items are pending to process in your queue, right? So all of these things. And even though if you don't produce metrics, like let's say manual or custom metrics like the ones that I just talked, if you're, for example, host your applications in a cloud provider like in Azure or in Amazon, you might already even get a lot of these metrics for free, like the request throughput, error rate, CPU memory, all these things. If you're familiar with Azure Application Insights, you have that nice overview page there with such things, right? So, but one limitation that metrics have is that they only go again so far as well. So they offer like a snapshot of what happened at that point in time, right? So for example, in this image here, you can see everything was more or less average, but then there was that huge spike there, and then like depending what the metric is, you can say, okay, this is good or not good. But then that's it, right? You can't really pinpoint why that happened. It was because something broke or because there was a lot of customers. You really can't really tell easily, right? Um, and then so the next then the telemetry data that we saw is the distributors. This might be not so familiar to a lot of folks. It also known as traces only, and depending on the vendor that you use, they might call it different. For example, in Azure, they call it transaction. Um, which is a nice term because the way I like to understand, or the way I got told and I learned, I was able to observe this, is that a distributed tracing is a way of grouping a bunch of operations together, right? So a trace is basically a transaction. And in this example here, you can see like there is a, a, a JavaScript application, a client application, and from the moment, for example, that the user clicked on the button to do something, in this case, for example, update their profile page, a myriad of operations were kicked off, right? So the user wanted to update their profile. So then there was calls to the profile service, and then the profile service need to check the authentication and then call the database. There was some images being uploaded to a blob storage, and then some notifications happen. So all of these things happen because the user starts something, right? And then in a distributed tracing, trace, you can see all these operations grouped together. And then this is great because it captures all the casually related operations. In a nutshell, it allows you to retrace all the story that happened and everything. Um, and I think the other thing that is great about tracing is that it's a very good visual tool because you can look at this, you can immediately, for example, spot the operations that are taking a long time. For example, like if your system is slow, you can immediately see like what API requests are taking a lot of time. Is it the database? Is maybe some query that needs to be optimized, right? It's very easy to see here. So a trace is composed as operations, right? So each little box that you see here is an operation, and this operation is known as a span, right? So you'll see this name if you start getting into this area, you see this term a lot about span. So a span is an operation, and it's a span because it spans across time. So it has a duration. So the operation took some time to conclude. In a span also is great because it's basically a bag of data, and then you can attach a lot of info about this operation. For example, here it was the post to the profile service. We can see that there's things, for example, like the name of the service, what was the verb that was used, was a post, and to which URL was it this request successful. You can see, for example, events that are there related to this. If there were any exception thrown during this, it would be shown there in errors. And the IDs that you see there is something that don't have really time to dig into here, but the way a trace works, the way all these things are correlated to each other, that you can see them in this nice graph, is because there's a concept called context propagation. The way basically very too long didn't read format is in the beginning of the transaction, some IDs are generated. For example, when the user there clicked the button, and these IDs get passed on to each operation. And if each component involved in the transaction is instrumented, is able to understand this, it will create its own ID and then pass it on. So create and pass it on. So this way, it's able to construct this tree of dependencies and tree of calls. If you've been with .NET enough, there was something, or maybe there is even around today, called the correlation ID. So maybe that's something that you, from your days or from some time ago, that you can relate to this. And another thing that you get, let's say more or less for free with distributed tracing, is that you have these things usually called like a service map, or I think in Azure they're called application maps, which because the backends where you're sending all this telemetry data to know about all this metadata, they can construct such graphs, right? So they can see which services are there, which dependencies they're there, who calls what, and they can do cool things. For example, like if there's a lot of calls to one service, the line here gets a little bit thicker, or if there's errors, the line can be red, for example, to indicate that there's a lot of problems happening. So this is a great tool as well for like visualizing, put in a dashboard maybe for things like this. So this is another, like say, side effect, like a good side effect, because you get this more or less for free, right? Because you already have all this data. All right, so we have all this, let's say, groundwork done now. So we know, or hopefully I was able to pass it on to you, that you have all this different things. It's not just logs, right? We have more things than this. This looks great, right? But except for one thing. Uh, if you, all these things that I just mentioned, they're not really like groundbreaking, right? It's not something that was released yesterday. They're there for quite a while now. But usually what happens is that people, when start doing this, they still have the same, let's say, way of doing things, right? So logs go to a system, metrics go to another, and then traces go to another, right? So, and then this doesn't really improve anything, because you still have the same manual, laborious, tedious approach that have to scroll things, have to mentally apply, have to mentally correlate all these things together to put some meaning in, or some to really find what is going on, right? And that's when we come to this term called observability, right? If you Google this, I'm sure there will be many blog posts and articles talking about what is observability. It's a very overloaded term by now. Um, but the way I like to, the way I resonate with it, it makes sense to me, is that observability is really a way to put things into context, right? It allows you to identify how your applications are behaving, right, and why they're behaving like that. Um, so observability really changed the perspective of things, because it goes from what you had there, like things separated, isolated, to something like this, right? They're intertwined, they're connected, they're in context with each other, right? So when this is applied, then our previous investigation that we saw, that was laborious, manual, you have to do all the correlation manually. Some people even say that is tab-based, like browser tab-based observability, because you have so many tabs that you have to keep browsing and to connect things. So it shifts from something like this to something more or less like this, right? It shifts to something that is more exploratory. Doesn't require necessarily that the person needs to know like the code base, needs to know that if that log, the class name, or that line of the code is present in the log, then this is really bad, right? For example, it starts from an alert maybe, and then you get a metric. From the metric, you can get a sample of an operation that happened during that problematic time. And then maybe you can immediately see in the trace graph that some operations are taking too long. For example, they are timing out, or that there is a lot of exceptions. And then you start digging into it, right? You start clicking and moving towards the suspicion of what is happening, for example. And then you, in this case, you see a lot of exceptions. You arrive at the authentication service, and then you say, maybe were there any deployments there, or there were any configuration changes? Yes, I see it here, because there was maybe the signing certificate was renewed. That's why all the tokens are being rejected now. So something like this, right? It changes the perspective. You don't need to start, for example, having to correlate things. You don't have to, for example, be careful to select the right time zone of your logs, or of your data, because then otherwise you will not find anything. You spend hours not finding, just finding out because you selected the wrong time zone, or things like that. So this is really a shift in how things are observed, in how you handle problems, right? So you might be now in this point, it's like, okay, like this really sounds promising, right? So how do I start with this? It's really okay. It's really simple. So you just, for example, go to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation landscape page, go to the monitoring observability, and then just pick one of the uh, uh, products or solutions there, right? So you might be thinking about feeling like this now after I showed you that page, or after you go there by yourself and see. It's like it's really overwhelming, and it's overwhelming because there's a lot of tools around, right? Uh, you don't know what to look out for if you're just starting. There's different tools, and then when you pick one, they don't talk to each other really well. So, for example, if later you want to change them, or for example, you're not really happy with the provider that you pick to send your data, you can't really switch things easily, right? You put all this engineering power hours to, let's say, instrument your infrastructure, your apps, then finding that the bill is getting too expensive, or you're not getting the value that you thought you would get from this provider. So you're basically in vendor lock-in, right? So this is not great. And I keep building expectation with you, right? I'm saying, this is good. No, but this is bad. This is good. This is bad. So is there a way out? There is, right? The way out is OpenTelemetry. So OpenTelemetry is a solution to solve all this concerns, right? And what is actually OpenTelemetry if you've never heard of it? So OpenTelemetry, and it's usually OTel for short, um, is a vendor-neutral open source observability framework that allows you to instrument, to generate and collect and export data about your applications to any place, right? So it's a set of tools that you install in your applications, and with these tools, you're able to collect all this data and then process them and then send them somewhere, right? It is also important to know what OpenTelemetry is, and there's some people get really confused about this, and expectations are not aligned. So OpenTelemetry is not a backend, so it's not a vendor where you send this data to, right? So where your data is stored, right? So OpenTelemetry doesn't offer any storage for this telemetry data that we just saw. Um, it also does not offer any visualization tool or any analytics tool or query, right? So it's simply a set of frameworks and tools that allows you to collect and to generate all this data and send somewhere, and that's it, right? And why hotel is a big deal, right? So uh, it is a big deal because of the thing that we just saw, right? So you have this problem of picking one solution and then being really like locked into that. So OpenTelemetry is a framework to solve all this because it's vendor neutral, agnostic, and it is the de facto standard for observability. So you install this, and then everybody will be able to understand it. So even if, for example, if you talk to some other application, the application also observed with OpenTelemetry, and that all these things work together, right? So in the end, you're able to establish all of these connections and correlations between them. And OpenTelemetry is a very healthy open source project. It follows well-established standards such as the W3C, and it's backed by big names. So there's a lot of uh, people that are really concerned about open source projects, right? They're really conservative and they don't want to depend on this because they don't know if this is going to survive 5, 10, 20 years, right? Is this going to be there, like if there are problems? So OpenTelemetry, as I said, is a very healthy, is the second most it's in the Cloud and Linux Foundation. It's only behind the Kubernetes project. So there's a lot of contribute, there's a lot of movement and momentum in there, and it's backed by huge names in this space like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Dynatrace, and many, many, many others. So it's really like here to stay. And before we actually go diving into how this can be used with .NET, um, I want to show you a little bit about what's the OpenTelemetry architecture. So what kind of components are there? It's important because when you actually start instrumenting, it's important that you know which thing to use correctly, right? To get the most out of it and to do it like the best you can. So the OpenTelemetry architecture, there's more to it, right? But in a high level, you can see you can think of it having like three parts. So there's the API, there's the SDK, and then there are exporters, right? So let's start first with the API. And a great analogy that I like to think is that if you're familiar with .NET and you know the iLogger interface, the OpenTelemetry API, it's pretty much like it, right? So the same way that, for example, in your libraries, you use the iLogger interface to just log things, right? You don't really care where this log is going to land on, which backend logs is going to be sent to. You just want to log, right? Whatever use my library, it will take care of configuring this, right? So the API, the OTel API, is the same. You install this in your applications, in your code, and then you instrument them. And then with this, you're able to generate, for example, metrics, logs, spans, like we saw. Um, and not really care where this data is gonna land to. And then this is huge because until now, for example, library authors, there was no like generic or vendor agnostic way to do such things, right? For example, in libraries, you already log things, right? For example, especially in .NET, the iLogger interface is there for quite a while. So you don't need to create your own iLogger interface. You just depend on this standard more or less. Uh, and then you just log. And then the same thing happens now with OpenTelemetry. So you build your libraries, you can already, for example, collect metrics pertinent to your business, for example. Or, for example, if you're author of a library, let's say a MongoDB driver, you can already instrument all the calls that goes to the database, for example, to collect metrics, to see how long the queries are, which, to extract information such as like what is uh, the longest running queries or things like that. So you can have that built into the libraries and ship that to customers, right, to users. And then users, when they install the library, they have that for free already, so which is amazing, right? To me, this is the like a mind-blowing thing that we have now. This opens a lot of doors. Then the next thing that I mentioned is the SDK, right? And another analogy here with .NET is the SDK would be more or less, the SDK together with the exporter that we'll just see right in a second, they're more or less like log providers. So like you have the API, but then you need to configure where this data is sent to, right? So the SDK is in a high level again, something like that, right? So install the SDK, and then you can configure many things with it. We're not going to go into details, but you configure all these things that are pertinent to the data, right? So and then the SDK, when you install it in the app, it will go and collect all this telemetry data that the API has generated. For example, so let's say you have an ASP.NET app, and then you're using Entity Framework or using MongoDB or Redis or something. So if those libraries are already instrumented, then when you install the SDK, all this telemetry data that those libraries produced, the SDK will collect that and then ship somewhere, right? And the other nice thing that the design of the OpenTelemetry architecture allows is, for example, if in your app you don't configure the OpenTelemetry SDK, even though you have all these libraries already instrumented, there will be no overhead or very low overhead for you because the API is done in a way that it's developed in a way that it's aware that there is no SDK, for example. And when there is no SDK, the data that it generates is just no op. So right, it's just like empty data. So there will be low overhead. And even if you have the SDK, the overhead it's relatively low and compared to the huge benefit that you have of your apps being observed, right? And offering all these tools that you can have to improve your troubleshooting journey. So the last thing then that I want to talk about here about the architecture is the exporter. So this is really like the log providers, and the beauty of it is that you can have many exporters, right? So again, like you instrument your apps, your infrastructure once with OpenTelemetry, and then you can pick where you want to send to, right? So you can send to multiple places at the same time to try things out to see which one you like best. So in the example here, you can see that the SDK is configured with two exporters, and one is sending directly to a vendor. It could be to Azure, for example, it could be to Dynatrace, to any other backend, but it's also sending to the OpenTelemetry collector. We're not gonna don't have much time, unfortunately, to talk about the OpenTelemetry collector, but the collector is you can say more or less like a proxy. It's a executable that it runs in your infrastructure. It can run in different models, but it runs in your infrastructure and it can act as like a central point of data ingestion or data collection. So you send all the data to the collector, um, and then you can configure the collector. It's very powerful. So you can configure it to do, for example, data massaging, to remove, for example, private information, to enrich it with some more data, and then also configure it multiple places where you want to send this. We'll see an example during the demo. All right, so this is, let's say, a very quick overview of the OTel architecture. And then let's dive in how actually things work in .NET. So how can you use OpenTelemetry with .NET? So first, I just want to talk about support because it's important to know what's out there. So it works with .NET and with .NET Framework. It has already stable releases for traces and metrics. Logs are advancing quickly, so it will soon also be stable. The SDK is stable because it relies on the iLogger, so that's already stable. But the exporter of logs is still not stable. So, but it's getting there. Soon it will be there. There's very good already out of the box instrumentation support for popular libraries and frameworks. For example, there's instrumentation libraries for ASP.NET. We'll see in a minute, for HTTP client, and for libraries like Entity Framework, Hangfire, Redis, and many more. Right in this link here in the slides, you will be able to go to the GitHub repository, and then we'll see all the list of instrumentation. You can see if the library that you use is already there. And also there is a beta version of a agent style instrumentation that's basically an agent that you deploy as well in infrastructure, but that hooks into your apps and does all this configuration for you, like configures SDK and so on. So you don't, it really reduces what you have to do. But then also the power of all of this is that also you mix the auto instrumentation with some manual instrumentation, right? As we'll see in the demo coming up. And how do I actually use this? So I have some examples of some slides showing how to do or how to get started with an ASP.NET app. So no surprises at first, you need some packages. So you install the SDK, and then we need the exporter. So you can see here that I'm using the OpenTelemetry protocol export that this comes with OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry has its own protocol that defines the data, the telemetry data that we saw in previous slides. So this is the export that exports in this format, in the OpenTelemetry protocol format. And then I also have some libraries that does the instrumentation. So that does all these nice things for me. Like there's one there for, I'm using one from ASP.NET, as I said, for HTTP clients to catch all the outgoing requests, and also to track my Entity Framework database queries. Okay, so after that, then you need to configure your services, your pipeline in ASP.NET. That's the usual that you do. Probably you are all familiar with this. So you add the package, then you start with, for example, in this case with trace. I'm configuring the trace part. I configure a service. A service will be like the identifier of my application. And then here I'm configuring, I'm enabling the auto instrumentation. For example, I am adding there again the HTTP client, the ASP.NET Core, and the Entity Framework. And you can see there at the end, I am adding the OpenTelemetry protocol exporter. And there's no configuration there because by default, the OpenTelemetry specification says it is specified that by default, it will try to export to a default port, and that is the OpenTelemetry collector that is running in my infrastructure. So I don't have to configure anything. And for metrics, it's really similar. So with metrics, again, define my service, and then again, enable the instrumentation. So this, for metrics, it will be able to collect all these nice metrics about, for example, the duration of my HTTP requests, the duration of my outgoing requests, and all these nice things. And again, here, I'm also exporting to the locally running collector via OTLP, the OpenTelemetry protocol exporter. And then for logs, a little bit different. This might change because it's still not there, but it's pretty much like you would configure, let's say, another log provider, right? So you say logging, and then add OpenTelemetry, and then again configure my services, and then again telling it to export to my collector. So you can see that all the data, all this telemetry data that we saw, metric, logs, and traces, I'm exporting them all to the same place, to the collector, right? There's no configuration here about which vendor I want to use. There's no configuration about Azure or anything. I'm all sending to this central proxy. And then after you have all this configured, then it's time to actually produce data, right? So again, if the auto instrumentation packages will collect a lot of data, but also you get a lot of you get a lot of benefit as well from doing manual instrumentation, right? To tracing the business side or the business operations of your app, right? So for example, if I want to create a span, like an operation that we saw as part of a transaction, for example, that's how I would do it. You start an activity that is called also a span, and then everything that happens, you see that the using there, the scope, everything that happens inside this span, right? This operation will be all correlated. So for example, if an exception happened there doing this, or I logged something, this will be all tied together with the span, right? So again, like the observability concept of correlating things, putting things into context, right? And then with the span, I can set tags or also as attributes. In .NET, they call it a tag. But here, for example, you can add any information that you want that you think it's important for this transaction, right? For lady debugging, for example. Here I'm adding the user ID, and then I'm also recording an event, and then I'm manually setting a status, for example. But for also like if there was an exception here, this would be set automatically by the SDK, right? So you would understand that there's an exception, and the span here, the current span will be marked as 0. Just did here for demo purposes. And then for metrics, I want to, for example, record something here. You need a meter, and then with the meter you can create instruments. So for example, here I'm creating a counter because I want to count something. There's different instruments. You can then look it up at the OpenTelemetry documentation. But here I just want to count something. So I create a counter, I give it a name, and then I can count something, right? So I can add one, and then in this metric, I want, for example, to be able to split them or to see different angles of it. And then here, for example, I'm counting one, I'm seeing a fruit, an apple, and then the apple is red, right? So then I'm able to plot this metric in a chart and see, for example, how many red apples I'm seeing in the last hour and things like that. And for logging, it's pretty much like the standard, just logging a message, right? Picking a severity and things like that. Okay, great. So now we know about the telemetry data. We know about observability, about all these things, and now we know also how to get started with .NET. So I have prepared a small demo for you now. Hopefully, everything will work out. Stay with me. Uh, we can do this. Um, yeah, so the demo that I have prepared is more or less laid out like this. So it is an API that is protected by JWT tokens. So and the tokens come from this project that you maybe know about. Is Identity Server is a OpenID server. So I have these two ASP.NET applications running here on my Docker Compose. And the API then talks to Identity Server to obtain tokens or to validate the user tokens that are calling the API. And the API then is protected by this policy-based authorization in ASP.NET, and then the permissions are in the database. So the API needs to talk to the database to fetch this permission for the user, and then the API also does custom code to evaluate if the user has the necessary permissions that the endpoint that they're trying to call requires. And all these apps, they produce all this telemetry data that we have been talking about. So traces, metrics, and logs. So they, as we saw in the snippets of code, they all send to the OpenTelemetry collector in the default port. And then my collector, I will show you in a moment, is configured to send the data to all these backends, right? So again, my apps are, there is no Azure library code. There's nothing, there's no Azure dependency, Azure Monitor application insights dependency in my apps. There's no Dynatrace dependencies, there's no Jaeger, nothing, right? There's simply 100% OpenTelemetry running there. And just to illustrate how the collector works, so here's my collector configuration. In my collector here, you can see that I have exporters there. The most important part here is the exporters. So you can see that I have the Jaeger exporter, the Azure Monitor exporter, and then the OTLP, again, the OpenTelemetry protocol, VHTP, and that is configured not here. Of course, I don't want to expose my secrets here to you, but that is configured to send to Dynatrace, right? And then in the end, in the service pipelines, is where you can configure the different telemetry data that we saw, again, trace metrics and logs, and where do you want to receive them, and where do you want to export them. And you can see there that I have a configuration that, for example, traces and metrics, traces are sent to Dynatrace, to Azure Monitor, and to Jaeger, and metrics are sent to Dynatrace and Azure. And logs are printing on my console here, and to Dynatrace again, and to Azure Monitor. So this is all I need, and then all this data will land there, right? So I'll switch to my demo now. So here you can see this is my API running. So this is a usual Swagger app. And then let me just refresh this, and I'll authorize here. So I usually log in. I think I'm already logged in, so that's why it was didn't ask for my. I'm already logged in identity server. So now I have a token, and I'll try to call one of the endpoints. So my API here is aligned that there are two users, and each of these endpoints require one permission, right? So for example, the get requires the read permission, the post requires the create, and so on. And currently I'm logged in with this user Bob, and Bob can call the get products, as I will just show you. So Bob can get the products, and we got the products here, the 200. But Bob cannot create anything. Only Alice can. So if I try to call this, then I get a forbidden, a 403, because the token that I have does not have the necessary permission. So my app does all these evaluations, right? So this didn't work. And I want to show you how this, so like all this data was generated, right? I already prepared some sample data, so we don't have to wait for things being ingested and sent to the different backends. So first we'll look at how this looks like in Azure. So I have here my application insights set up. And again, like I said in the beginning, you have this nice metrics that you get for free, more or less. So this is what I see here in Azure. It was not running for a while, so it looks a bit boring. But this is what you get. I said that you get for free, right? So, and this here is the distributed trace view in App Insights, right? So the first call that I had here was the call that worked, so the call to get the products, and you can see that there's a lot of stuff here, right? So so you can see at the top here, I have my get products, but then the identity server application, which is completely separate, right? Is another process running that is also instrumented with OpenTelemetry. And that here is again the key of things, right? Because the identity server authors, they already instrumented all their code with OpenTelemetry, and the only thing that I had to do is configure it where to send the data. That was it, right? They already built all of this into their code, into the library, and then that's how I get all these nice things here. I don't know if you're familiar with Identity Server, but I used it a lot in the past. And when things go wrong with it, it was not really easy to troubleshoot, right? Again, the same story. I had to go to logs. It was not really easy to find things, and I really spent a lot of time scratching my head why something was broken, right? And then here now I get all these things here. So I can see, for example, that this call was the first one, and then the token had to be validated and the keys had to be checked and all these things. So that's why you have all this information here. Don't want to go into all this details, not really relevant for this, but I just wanted to show you the power of the correlation, right? This is all here. I don't have to go to different places to look for things, right? It's all here for me in one place. And then the nice part that I want to show you here is that this is my business, let's say the business core of my app, right? I'm checking for the permission. So I have this custom middleware that I created here. That goes to the database, fetch the permissions, and then does the evaluation, right? So in this case here, there's all these operations, right? And then you can see, for example, here there's the database operation that was manually, that was automatically captured because I have that entity framework instrumentation. And you can see here, for example, there is the instrumentation package version, the name, the version is here. And then you also capture the SQL command that I run, which is really cool. No agent, nothing. I don't have to bloat my app with anything, right? I just installed one library and that line of code, and that all this is working. And then here I had another span that I created manually that is about when the policy is going to get evaluated. And then here when the policy is checked against the user's permissions, right? In this case here, everything it worked because the user had the permission, right? So and then here as well, I can also see the logs of all this operation. Again, I didn't have to go to a separate system, filter by time or anything. Like I just click on one operation and then I see all the logs here, right? I see again, like the SQL call is here. And then I should have a message here saying that the user had the permission, everything worked. Yes, so every backend does this differently. And you can see here, for example, this is the message. So when everything works, I log out information that the user had all the required information, so everything was good. But if you remember, I also called an endpoint where Bob didn't have the permission. So it was to create products, and it's the one here, the post. And you can see this is immediately shows as red because something failed, right? And I don't have all the huge the other huge trace, all the other spans, because the scope, the token was already validated, so I didn't have the identity server didn't have to be called to check because it was already valid. But here again, like the same, the middleware is invoked and so on. But here now I have an error, right? And here, if I click here, I can see that something went wrong, right? And then if I also click here, then I will see the same logs, and I can immediately see that the user did not have the required permission. And then I also can see here that it was the permission create that the user did not have, right? So again, from an alert or for something that was wrong, I can easily, quickly find it. I didn't have to fiddle with different system or anything. I just kind of explored, right? And was curious. It's like a curiosity. It's like, this is red. This is taking too long. Why? And then I just go explore. And then I have all this information that can help me find things. And then just to prove that this is working, that I'm sending data to multiple places, there's another thing here about the metrics I forgot. I also collect some custom metrics here that I wanted to show you, because, for example, for my app, it was important to know how many authorizations my app was performing, right? So and then I created this custom metric during the authorization work. I also count how many were successful and how many were unsuccessful. So in this chart here, you can see like the green ones are the one that worked, and the red ones are the one that did not work. So you can just put this in a dashboard, for example, to have that nice overview of the health of your system. And then, so again, like just to continue, so I want to show you that this is actually shipping to other backend, not just to Azure, and I didn't have to do anything in my app. So this is like the same more or less view in Dynatrace. Not any advertisement, just because I have a license and it's easy for me to show. So here you have the same, like, for example, the metrics of the services. I can see the error rate, and here I can also see the custom metric that I created for the overview of the number of authorizations that I'm making. Can also see all the spans, the operations that are happening in my app, all here in one page. Like, I don't have to browse anything. I can also see all the logs that were happening here, and the same operation that we saw in the other. It's refreshing. Let's wait a little second. See if my other tab. All right. Yes, I'm running things on a very edge version of the system here. So, but let's look at another trace here. All right, let's not. Let's try to. I will try to show you something else. So, okay, so for the logs, for example, I have a trace, and then the logs I also don't need to. For example, it's the same thing that I was showing you. Again, loading, that I was showing you on Azure. On Azure, they have this other view here that you can click on this and see the logs that happened in this transaction. Here in Dynatrace, we also have the same. So you just have to filter by the trace that you want. So, for example, here I can see that the same problem, that the user did not have the permission. And the nice thing here, I can jump from one operation to another, right? So, for example, I am here in this, and then hopefully this goes to the trace. There's some retention. It's a dev environment, so the data is deleted after some time. Yeah, okay, unfortunately. But you can see the same data that you have in another view. You can also have in the other one. So this is the power of such configuration here, because you have you configure once, you instrument your apps once, and then all the data is sent to all this place once, and then you have all this nice correlation and everything, right? Okay, so that is good. I think that is it for this. Think we have some time for questions. So if anybody has any questions here, we can. Okay, we have a question there. Will using OpenTelemetry API NuGet package get rid of application insights as dependencies of my libraries? Yes. So if you depend on the application insights today to instrument things, you can use the OpenTelemetry API, and then that should be enough, right? You can collect all these things, you can collect trace metrics, and logs will still use the iLogger, but yes, that should remove the dependency. The application insights, they have an exporter package that allows you directly from your app to send to Azure. But there's also a community. So if I go back to my collector here, this Azure Monitor exported to here in my collector, that is a community-based component developed by the community. It's not from Microsoft, but that works well because then I don't need any Microsoft package in my code, just plain vanilla OpenTelemetry, and then here in my collector I have this Azure dependency, let's say, in the collector, and then that sends to application insights directly. Yeah, so you should be able to not depend on any application insights. I hope that answered your question. All right. Anything else? If not, if you don't feel comfortable asking here, I will also be in the Q&A session, Q&A area in GatherTown, and also I'll probably move later on to the Dynatrace booth there, the virtual booth, so you can also go there and chat with me if you want to have questions about our product and our support and all the things. So just feel free to go there. And if there's no questions, then I like to thank you for having me, and thanks for joining me here for this session.